Thank you, Ambassador. Our next speaker, Rizvi, is most known for an award-winning author of the book The Atheist Muslim, A Journey from Religion to Reason. Today he will speak on Islamic ideology, Muslim identity, and secularism. Ali grew up in a progressive Muslim family in Libya, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. In his 20s, he permanently moved to Canada. As a physician, he trained in pathology at SUNY Buffalo and the Roswell Park Cancer Institute. Ali also holds a Master of Science degree in biochemistry from McMaster University. In 2011, he switched his career to medical communications so he could focus more on his writings. Ali is an avid and vocal advocate for secularism, science, and reform, particularly in the Muslim community. You can read more about him on theatheistmuslim.com. Last but not least of our speakers today, please welcome Ali Rizvi.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Muslimish. Thank you, Wassam. Thank you, Ibrahim, Nora, everybody who organized this. The fun part. So I'll get started since I had a more formal talk lined up, but like I did last time. But since it seems like a nice, intimate setting, it's very conversational, so I thought I'd make this a little bit more interactive. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is just identity, ideology, secularism. So identity, we're going to be talking about Muslim identity. When it comes to ideology, Islamic ideology. And then how secularism fits into this whole picture. So I want to start with a question to all of you. That how would you define a Muslim? We've had some discussion about this earlier today too. But what would you say today is a Muslim?
So everybody who calls himself Muslim, you describe yourself as Muslim, you're Muslim.
You're Muslim. So anybody who describes themselves as a Muslim is a Muslim. Right. Go ahead. Someone who thinks of the Quran as the word of God, revealed through Muhammad, and believes in the afterlife. That's a Muslim. And anybody else?
You're asking about the technical word Muslim or what really Muslim
Just
means?
Open, like whatever you think. Because a Muslim, if you ask different people right now, I mean, they're
Of course, the answer is different.
Yeah, the answer is different. So let's move on to the next question. And I'll come to this and we'll return to this. How would you define Islam? We've defined Muslim, or the different, how would you define it? Ibrahim, you want to try it?
Islam is Quran. It's what's in the book, Quran, because that's the only thing that all Muslims agree on. All sects, all groups of Muslims agree on one book, and that's the Quran.
Okay. Do we agree on that? The Quran is pretty much defines what Islam is?
No.
No? So how would you define it?
Well, Islam to me, I would want to talk about what Islam means to people. Islam is different to people. Like Islam practice in certain part of the world different than others.
And so that's the way it's practiced, but is a Quran an element? If something is practiced that is not according to the Quran?
Well, actually, I have friends who just believe in Quran only, and other people who say Quran only is enough. You have to because Quran doesn't tell you how to pray, how to do.
So you need the hadith.
So you have hadith.
Yeah. So, but overall, the Quran is still an element that even if there's a Quran only people or Quran hadith, they still both have the Quran as a denominator. So I wanted to move on to this. The reason I asked this question is I'm going to present a quote from I think I've done this before, from an Indian American Muslim. So this is an American Muslim. He's quite famous, one of the most prominent American Muslims in the country. His name is Fareed Zakaria. Everyone knows he's a journalist. He's an Indian American. And so Farid Zakaria immigrated here from India, and then he's from a Muslim family in India, and then he, went to Harvard, became educated, and then later on he became a very prominent journalist. So at the end of December 2015, like pretty much just 2 years ago, after the San Bernardino shootings, Donald Trump, who was a candidate at the time, came out and he said that he wants to propose, quote, a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until we can figure out what the hell is going on with Donald Trump. In response to that, Farid Zakaria wrote an article in the Washington Post that was titled, "I Am a Muslim." So that was the title of his article. And here I'm going to read verbatim a quote from the article. Here's what he said. "I think of myself first and foremost as an American. I am proud of that identity because as an immigrant, it came to me through deep conviction and hard work, not the accident of birth. I also think of myself as a husband, father, guy from India, journalist, New Yorker, and on my good days, an intellectual. But in today's political climate, I must embrace another identity. I am a Muslim." He goes on, "I am not a practicing Muslim. The last time I was in a mosque, except as a tourist, was decades ago. My wife is Christian, and we have not raised our children as Muslims. My views on faith are complicated, somewhere between deism and agnosticism. I'm completely secular in my outlook, but as I watch the way in which Republican candidates are dividing Americans, I realize that it's important to acknowledge the religion into which I was born." So my next question to you is Farid Zakaria a Muslim? He says he is. He wrote an article saying, "I am a Muslim." But he clearly, he doesn't believe in scripture. He considers himself between agnosticism and deism, which means that deism means he doesn't believe in a personal God that actually interferes or intervenes in human affairs, which is antithetical to Islamic belief. So, is Farid Zakaria a Muslim because he said he's a Muslim?
If you relate it to the basic principle of Islam, no, he's not.
No, he's not, from the basic.
He doesn't believe all what he says, he's not believing. Cannot consider him as, again, I say it's traditionally the way how Islam is defined. Mm-hmm. The main core of Islam. What Mr. Zakaria wrote is not compatible.
It's not compatible. So he doesn't seem like he believes in Islam, but he says that he is a Muslim. He doesn't believe in Islam, the religion, or as you said, as defined by the Quran. But he calls himself a Muslim.
I don't pass the judgment.
Right.
I don't. Mm-hmm. I mean, he considers himself a Muslim, he's a Muslim.
Okay.
The one who just between him and God.
Between him and God.
If
so,
if he's a believer, actually.
Yeah, and this is one thing I wanted to demonstrate. Even though we have a modest group over here, there are a lot of different ideas about what is a Muslim, what's not a Muslim, what Islam is, what Islam isn't. The whole original definition of a Muslim is someone who believes in the Islamic religion that there 1,400 years ago. It's much, much more open now, and people think of it very differently. To everybody, to someone like ISIS, the Shia aren't Muslim. To many mainstream Shia, the Ahmadis aren't Muslim. To the Ahmadis, ISIS aren't Muslim. And people will say ISIS has nothing to do with Islam. Other people will say that no, they are Islamic, right? But they're not good Muslims. And so the dialogue is much more diverse. There's much more diversity of opinion and interpretation of these words, Muslim and Islam, these labels, than anything else. So I want to move on here. So I think that the fact that one of the problems with Trump and the whole Trump and alt-right and the advent of these people that have come in is that it's a good thing that they're making us have these conversations. But at the same time, if you imagine the way that when you bring up this issue of identity, when you talk about Islam and Muslims in the kind of way that someone like Donald Trump does, you take a guy who came here, he assimilated, through his achievements and his work, he rose above his birth identity. And now what you're doing is you're actually driving him back, where he has to write an article going back to the tribalistic identity that he originally had. And this has been a very, very toxic thing. Right? So people are, I think, much more than what they believe. But you hear it all the time. You know, there's a conflation of Islam and Muslims. And Islam and Muslims are not the same thing. Islam is a set of ideas, it's a doctrine in a book or in books. Muslims are people, they're human beings. Right? Books don't have rights, human beings do have rights. And the way that we define these two terms is extremely important. Now this distinction can be really challenging to navigate in practice. And it's mainly because Islamic ideology, Islam is an ideology, Muslim is really more of an identity. The ideology and identity are very, very inextricably interlinked. They're completely sort of intertwined together, and it makes it very difficult for people to pry apart, including when it comes to Muslims themselves. And what this integration does is for people who want to leave Islam, or they want to change their mind, and say that, okay, I've read this, I don't really believe this anymore, I don't believe part of this, or whatever their journey is. It's no longer just an intellectual process. It's not like you believe in a scientific theory and now you don't believe in it, now you the scientific theory, no controversy. There's nothing emotional about that. That's an intellectual process. But when you change your mind about this set of ideas, and that's all it is, just a set of ideas and beliefs. It's not just an intellectual process, but it's also an emotionally fraught, full-blown identity crisis. And you see this. And yes, again, Islam is just a religion, it's a collection of ideas in a book, but the experience of being Muslim, whether you're practicing or not, is much more nuanced and complex. So, that brings us to the next question. What is the Muslim experience? Is there such a thing as a Muslim culture? And the truth is, Muslims around the world are culturally heterogeneous, like you said. I mean, there are, like Pakistani Muslims, I'm from Pakistan. Pakistani Muslims have more cultural similarities with Indian Hindus than we do with Arab Muslims, except for Ibrahim. We're pretty much the same person. And people from the Arab world, they probably know that Arab Muslims often have more in common culturally with Arab Christians than they may with Indonesian Muslims. Maybe a completely different world, and so on. But there are some elements of Muslim culture that are universal. So, the festival of Eid, for example, is celebrated in all Muslim communities. The iftar, or fast-breaking feasts in Ramadan, are common across all Muslim cultures, or all Muslim societies. And these rituals, they're like the rituals in other religions, where, children are given gifts or money. People take days off of work, they travel, they meet their loved ones, they have dinner with their family. And what happens during these holidays and these celebrations is interesting. The focus shifts from ideology and moves towards community. And this is where there's a really key distinction. Islam is an ideology, and Muslims are a community, and they can be a community. Ideologies can drive people apart, but community brings people together. And this is why a distinction between Islam and Muslims, especially now in the 21st century, is extremely important. This is why Muslimish, just conceptually, is a great place to explore this topic. So, I come from a background where my parents were very accepting of me questioning my faith, and even ultimately rejecting it outright. So I don't believe in Islam, I don't believe in any other religion. I was never forced to pray or fast or be religious, even though both of my parents were believing and practicing Muslims. But today, and I think it's because I wasn't forced into it, today I still take part in them. So in my family, which includes a lot of religious people, I'm there when there are Eid celebrations. I'm there with my nieces and my nephews, now my daughter, who I think most of you have been hearing throughout the day. Yeah, that was me imposing. I was like, now you know what So, I enjoy these rituals. I find them pleasant, I find them fun. I celebrate Eid, I celebrate Ramadan. I don't fast. I tell people I fast 3 times a day between meals. If I owe you $100, I can get you 5 or 10s. Same thing on top of the day. We do have a Christmas tree in our house. So we do it all. And my motto generally is that if there's a party and there's food, I'm there. I'm currently working on my 3rd love handle. But I'm also the first to admit that my situation is unique. So most of the ex-Muslims or the former Muslims that I know, like me, have had to give up a lot more than I have. I grew up in 3 very different Muslim majority countries. I grew up in Libya, in Saudi Arabia, and in Pakistan. And I didn't come to North America until I was 24. So I was exposed to the interplay between how religion, culture, and all of these things mix in 3 countries, one in North Africa, one that was the birthplace of Islam, and the 3rd that was in South Asia. And so that exposure was very important to me. And in all of these places, many of these people, many of these young people I know who leave their religion, and they just change their mind about the beliefs and the ideas that they grew up with. This results in much more than just a different way of thinking. It results in being disowned by their parents. It results in being ostracized and marginalized from their communities, losing their friends, their family, all of their associations of childhood. I would love to go back to Riyadh and see the place where I grew up, the school I went to, meet the neighborhood. It's obviously not possible anymore. But that's the least of it. They face persecution. They face being killed by a mob, like the secular bloggers in Bangladesh, or Mashal Khan in Pakistan, who was lynched by a mob, essentially, on a university campus by fellow students. They can be imprisoned, they can be executed by their governments. And in my book, what I say is that unfortunately, this is one of the situations where changing your mind can literally mean losing your head. So while I can enjoy the iftar parties with my family, I can enjoy Eid, someone who was forced to fast as a child won't. So I wanted to bring in, has anybody here heard of Phil Zuckerman, the author who wrote Living the Secular Life? Yeah, so he's a very good writer. I happen to know him as well. And he came up with this concept that I think is very relevant to Islam, the Muslim community, and especially people who leave Islam. And he talks about mild apostasy versus transformative apostasy. So an example of this is I had my parents were university professors, as I said. They were very tolerant, very comfortable with me, fasting, not fasting. So I have positive associations with at least the ritualistic elements of, Muslim culture. On the other hand, my friend Yasmin Mohammed, who grew up her whole life in Vancouver, she was forced to wear the full burqa and the niqab from a very early age. When she was 20 years old, she was forced into a marriage with a man who was an Al-Qaeda militant who's now in Egypt. He's in jail. And he was personally trained by Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. She has written, actually, in her upcoming book, I won't give too much of it away, about some horrific things she went through. So while I may enjoy my Eid, for her, even when she got out of this 20 years ago, she had a child with him, and now, you know, she's out of it. She went to university, he's in jail, you know, she's remarried, she's gotten her life back. But for her, even, you know, hearing Arabic sometimes triggers her. It's traumatic for her. And she speaks it. There are elements of it. Like she likes the food, she likes everything, but she reacts to it in a very different way than I do. So she came from a background where the religion that her family imposed on her was very oppressive. I have a different association with it. And that also makes a difference. Like those experiences, like even within the former Muslim community, people who were formerly Muslim, they also have very, very different experiences. And it's important to hear these and understand that there's a diversity of experience, you know, even when you go into minorities with the minorities. So, what about identity? Has these people who are transformative apostates, like Yas, have they given up their identity? And how does the concept of Muslim identity play into the experience of someone who has made every effort to purge it from their new transformed self, which is something many people do? There was a French sociologist, Emile Durkheim, I think many of you might have heard of them. They described the phenomenon of anomie, it's spelled A-N-O-M-I-E. And this is a kind of a moral identity crisis that's characterized by instability and a breakdown of social connections between an individual and his or her community. So, for example, I've known and corresponded with people who came from really repressive Islamic households, who left the religion, and when they left the religion, their parents, for example, disowned them, and they go out on their own, and you meet them, and they have this sort of state of euphoria, and you go out with them, and they're always ordering bacon on everything, right? So there's a reactive thing, and then suddenly, you know, they're like, I'm gonna have bacon with this, I'm gonna have bacon with my watermelon, and then what? Then you sit, you're like, okay, listen, I understand this, you know, you're having bacon, it's delicious, but you know, this stuff can kill you. You can't do this. Have bacon all the time. Often they'll do it with alcohol. Often they'll, you know, suddenly someone who's very sexually repressed when they're younger, they'll go out and become very, very promiscuous. And the pendulum swings the other way. And this isn't just a phenomenon that's unique to Islam and ex-Muslims. It's as Durkheim said, it's a common thing for anybody who has a certain prescribed moral compass from society that's ripped out from under them, and they have an identity crisis, and now they have to build it back up, fragment by fragment. So it often leaves a vacuum, right? And it can take some time before they reformulate a renewed sense of identity and connection to their new milieu. And generally, those in this who find a community of like-minded peers seem to fare better. I went to a party once of ex-Muslims. I was invited, and these are people who, it was on Eid, and these are people who were disowned by their families, and so Eid was a very traumatic time for them, because, you know, they miss being with their family. These people, they still have connection with their family, and just because they changed their mind about something, their families said leave, so they had a party on Eid. Again, all of the dinner dishes had bacon, and bacon halim and bacon biryani are not good. Just wanted to and you know, they had so many of them were sort of being exposed to free mingling with the opposite sex for the first time. You know, they were trying to overcome. It was interesting. A lot of the men were being very overtly, demonstrably respectful to women, who, in ways that, you know, they had been taught that they didn't do. They were taught about certain gender roles, and they were trying to break past that. All of this was very palpable and observable, and I thought it was healthy. And ultimately, what happens is people do reach an equilibrium. But this goes to show that the fact that this kind of thing happened on Eid, that it was reactive to elements of Islam and Muslim culture, like modesty culture. You know, many of the girls who had been raised wearing hijab are now wearing very revealing clothing. They had the pendulum swung the other way. Or the taboos on pork and alcohol and so on, whatever it was reactive to a lot of the restrictions that they had before. And the fact that it was so emotionally fraught is evidence that this process, even transformative apostasy, is integrated with a sense of identity. So being Muslim isn't just about Islam. There's an element of identity, a Muslim identity, that plays into it even when you're trying to get rid of it. Even when you've left the religion, it still lingers, that experience still lingers. Now, why is this important to understand the difference between Islamic ideology and Muslim identity? It's because when we talk about Islam, how you define it as defined in the Quran, critically, and when you subject it to scrutiny, you have to understand where this sensitivity and reactivity comes from. We should criticize and challenge ideas. That's important to move a society forward. Historically, that's all been done. I say it's Sunnah. I mean, one of the biggest blasphemers himself was the Prophet Muhammad. He went out and he was chased out of Mecca. He came back, he smashed all the idols of the Quraysh. I mean, he was a blasphemer. So whenever people ask me, are you blaspheming? Well, it's Sunnah. This is what it is, following the example of the Prophet. So any great idea, any transformative idea usually starts off as a rebellion. It starts off as a blasphemy. But, it's important to understand why people get offended. It's not wrong for them to get offended. That's just natural whenever we're bringing about any kind of change. But it is good to understand why. And this is where the identity aspect comes in. People when their beliefs or ideas are attacked and they look at it as an attack on their identity, that is something that is relatively unique to religious communities. For instance, I believe in gravity. I think general relativity is a wonderful theory of gravity. Someone comes up and says, hey, I don't believe in gravity, I think you're wrong. I'd be like, okay. I'm not going to be offended. It doesn't bother me personally and beyond disagreement. But when it comes to believe in God and religion and faith-related ideas, it becomes a bigger deal than simple disagreement. Someone comes up and says that I don't agree with you, then people take offense because ideology, this religious ideology, is very intertwined with a sense of identity. And even if you look at scientific ideas like evolution, like this is something, if you tell somebody, that can be taken more personally than something like gravity because it does impinge on people's faith. It has been controversial in religious circles. So it's a very important insight to understand. So when to Muslims, to believing Muslims, I'd say, when you're asked about your faith, or when your faith is challenged, your ideas are challenged, don't react, respond, and think, am I defending my beliefs and ideas, or am I defending my identity, my heritage, the legacy of my parents and grandparents? They were all Muslims, they believed they were wonderful people, they raised me, I loved them a lot. How could you say that, what they believed is there's something wrong with it? And to people in the secular community, atheists and ex-Muslims, I'd say that this insight, understanding, is where it becomes very important to set the stage for a conversation. And it's important to understand that setting the stage for a conversation is much more important often than the conversation itself. And I tried this in the Atheist Muslim. In my book, I deliberately, despite the provocative title, I wanted to acknowledge and respect people's sense of identity, lock down a connection with them that, hey, I went through this too, I grew up like this is what my family was like, what your family was like, very similar. And once you lock down that connection on the identity aspect, then when I talk about the ideas, and I talk about criticizing the belief, I found that people were much more receptive to it. They didn't take it as personally. I got 30 seconds left. Can I get an extension for about a minute or two?
Yes, sure.
All right, because I wanted to move on to the third part of this, which was about secularism, which is very important. So it's very important to build that foundation before moving on to criticizing ideas. I've had a lot of Muslims in the audience for my talks and for the book. In fact, it was, and I think I mentioned this at the last conference too, it was reviewed by the New York Times by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who's a believing Muslim, and he gave it a very good review. And we were talking about this over lunch, and I was very surprised that he did. But I think he understood this distinction that I tried to make. And it's encouraging to me that you can have this dialogue. This dialogue is important, but it's important to understand and anticipate where somebody's reaction is going to come from. So, the beauty of secularism, and secularism is just separation of religion and state, that's really what it is that it acknowledges this difference. So, whenever I get people ask me a lot now, how can you criticize Islam but still respect Muslims? Aren't they the same thing? And it's usually Trump supporters say this. I remind them that this is the basis of secularism. It's to allow everybody to practice their faith the way they want, yet also to allow free thought and make sure that faith stays personal, doesn't interfere in the affairs of the state. But when it comes to the Muslim world, promoting secularism isn't as simple. Historically, the Muslim world has had a very difficult relationship with secularism, and for a host of reasons, encouraging Western-style secularism in Muslim countries comes with a great set of challenges. So, for millions of Muslims, secularism doesn't necessarily mean the kind of individual freedom and liberty that we think of in the West. Many associated with secularism with very negative and even humiliating aspects of their past and their history. So, there's Western imperialism, there's colonialism that chewed away a lot of their indigenous identities. If we set that aside, even when it came from within, their societies, it has impinged on the individual rights of the Muslim rather than bolstering them. An example is, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in Turkey. He enforced secularization in Turkey, and he effectively killed off any remnants of the Ottoman Empire, which was really the last great Islamic caliphate. He dismantled the Sharia, he changed the script, of the Turkish language from right to left into something that was not as reminiscent of Arabic. He banned the wearing of veils and turbans, so we know the history. So he did a lot of that. And even though he was a hero to many others saw him as an enemy of Islam. And there are other secular dictatorships that millions of Muslims have lived under for decades. So a lot of times they don't associate secularism with liberal democracy. They associate it more with dictators keeping religion down and at a distance. Who believe that such a religious uprising would be an existential threat to them, like Muammar Gaddafi or like Saddam Hussein, Bashar al-Assad, Hosni Mubarak. They've all played this game. They balance it. You could grow your beard and you praise Allah, and they'd be able to use you. But if the beard got a little too long, your voice got a little too loud, you'd be whisked away in the middle of the night, and nobody'd hear from you again. Because you became a threat to them. So in these scenarios, these religious uprisings have often come in the form of democratic resistance to secular dictators. Religious uprisings are a rebellion, a democratic rebellion to secular dictators. Iranian Revolution 1979 is an example. The election of Mohammad Morsi in Egypt after the downfall of Mubarak. The resistance to Assad in Syria today. These are, the Iranian Revolution that made Iran the theocracy that it is today was a response to the US-backed dictatorial rule of the Shah. And the Shah was never forgiven by the Iranians because he worked with the CIA and the British to help overthrow their democratically elected Prime Minister, Muhammad in 1953. And, people said this for the longest time, everybody denied it, and now they found out that that was a conspiracy theory that was true. So when you ask them about any of their conspiracy theories that they believe in, they're like, oh, did you forget about Masada in 1953? And it's a mess. So this is a problem, right? Secularism, liberalism, democracy, these are loaded words for many people in these societies. It doesn't necessarily guarantee their religious freedom. It's perceived very wrongly, of course, as an attack on their religious freedom. And this is a challenge for us. How are we going to get over this? Talk about it. When we talk to people in the Muslim world about it. So again, there's no easy answer for this that I can share. But the only insight that I think is important here as we move forward into the future is to remember that this is not about what kind of conversation needs to take place in the Muslim communities. It's about the precursor to that. It's about facilitating an environment where these conversations can happen in the first place. So, to finish, secularism is the only system that allows this kind of environment to flourish. Secularism is not anti-religion. It is simply the separation of religion from the affairs of the state. It allows both freedom of religion and freedom from religion. It not only allows citizens to practice their religion freely, but also protects the freedom of others to challenge it. Secularism is not the opposite of theocracy. This is very important to understand because this is a big misconception. Secularism is not the opposite of theocracy. It's the middle road between theocracy and anti-religious discrimination. While theocracy favors the power of one religion over all the others, secularism allows a plurality of religious belief and practice, where people of all faiths and no faith can coexist and engage in dialogue without fear of censorship or retribution, which is what Muslimish is, and that's why I support this organization. So, thank you.